so you know, I'm going to be talking a fair bit about Buddhism today because I think that the Buddhists are onto something about this idea of compassion and self-compassion. So, Sharon Salzberg, she's a wonderful Buddhist author and teacher. In 1990, she visited the Dalai Lama, and she had a conversation with him, and one of the things that she asked him was, so what do you think of self-hate? He said, what's that? And she had to explain to him how she often got down on herself. She felt inadequate a lot of the time, felt shame for things she felt or that she did, and he was completely aghast. He said, why would you do that to yourself? Right? He went on to explain something that he calls the Buddha nature that exists within each one of us in the Buddhist tradition. This is that center core of us that we might call it the authentic self, our higher self, our holy self, the God or goddess within. In the Christian tradition, we might see the Jesus within each of us. And almost every mystical arm of religion recognizes that there's within us, each of us, a core that is wondrous, it's beautiful and holy, and that it's often most experienced as compassion. So to the Dalai Lama, who lives in this state of compassion, he didn't understand this concept of self-hate. But our Western culture, on the other hand, doesn't really recognize this holy, beautiful self in each person. And I don't want to deify Buddhism, it has its own issues, right? But they also have some great wisdom around this. And our Western cultural issues are often around shame and self-hatred. And you know, most of us have a critical voice in our head that constantly points out what we do or do not do well. It's a part that belittles much of what we do, and unless it's done perfectly, and then it always seems to find fault in something. And for men, for example, it often comes out in any criticism perceived as weakness. For women, it often comes out as criticism for not looking perfect. And this self-hatred, shame, or critical voice, it can erode our self-esteem, it can make us question our gut instincts and our abilities, it can cause problems in relationships, it can even make us hurt ourselves. Remember that story that I just told you about the hawk and the dove, right? The king who cuts his thighs. Yeah, I had to change the ending of that story, actually, for today. Because the original ending of this Buddhist story is that the king so impresses the gods with his compassion for both of these beings that he's basically earned his way into heaven. And there's nothing said about how hurting himself might be kind of a foolish thing to do. So I had to change the story because this was not a message that was going to work well in our Western culture, right? Yeah. Our culture has this idea of sacrifice that has gotten so detrimental that sometimes we will literally harm ourselves on behalf of others, thinking that we're helping others. I didn't think that was a good story to tell our children, or anyone. You know, it's only a good ending, right, if you don't live in this Western culture. If you live in a Buddhist culture, maybe it's a wonderful culture or story. So, just to recall you, if you weren't here last week, I just want to quickly go over Sean's theology. And again, remember, whenever I point out theology, it's for you to understand where I'm coming from. You are not required to believe this theology. So, I talked about how we have a soul and a spirit. This is my theology. And that those two are connected. That the soul is here on this earth. It makes up our personality and who we are. It's informed by our experiences. But spirit is something that is eternal, everlasting, and we are connected to it along with so many other people as well. Now, it's also is that the spirit informs us and we inform spirit. It's something called process theology. It's a fairly modern theology. And it suggests that spirit or love or God or goddess or universe or whatever you want to call it is learning just as we are learning. And it continually invites us into being with itself. And I think that its love is greater than our self-hate. And if we let it, our spirit can help us heal. So if you recall, the more we hate or dehumanize others or even ourselves, the more we shut away spirit. Like this. But the more we love, the more spirit comes through. The more we in a sense, become like spirit. We merge with it, the more compassionate we become. And it looks more like this. This is what the Dalai Lama and Sharon Salzberg called our Buddha nature. I might call it living in spirit. And you know, religious and spiritual leaders and philosophers and poets and mystics have been trying to articulate what this looks like, what this feels like in our body, or what's it feel like just out there within us. We heard it in the poetry today, right? In the songs Rivers of Grace, or the elemental love, that spark within us. It's that place where love lives, including self-compassion. But until recently, nobody really had ever done any research on this. I mean, you know, mystics and poets and philosophers, they've been trying to figure this out for a while on their own, but now we're in the realm of science, right? And so now people are starting to look at this self-compassion. And in the last 15 years, research has exploded on the topic, with over 1,000 scholarly articles and books since 2003, with half of those in just the last 3 years. The person sort of leading the way on this, her name is Kristen Neff, and she kicked this off in 2003. She's a professor at the University of Texas Department of Educational Psychology. And she actually has, you can create a scale to measure how much self-compassion you have. You can go out to self-compassion.org. I'm a little above average, but still working on it. She defines self-compassion like this. So first of all, she says, obviously there's kindness toward yourself, right? Kindness toward when, not just when things are going well, but when you're suffering, when you're going through a tough time, you failed at something, you let yourself down, or you're upset and you want to cry. That's being kind to yourself. If you remember our meditation, right? Think of this, if you had a friend who talked to you like sometimes you talk to yourself, would you continue to hang around with that person? So, in other words, we want to kind of be, we go, not this, but more like this. The second definition is seeing oneself as fully human, as part of the human experience. What happens sometimes when this critical voice can make us feel isolated, as if, for example, that we're not, oh, nobody feels like I do, nobody is like me in what I'm going through. But instead, self-compassion then sees what we are as part of the greater human experience. And then the third definition of self-compassion is to see reality. In other words, being mindful awareness of those negative thoughts that come up that want to tear us down, that we actually see things as they are, not as we make them up to be. So as Jennifer Apso puts it, not horribilizing. Right? I don't know about horribilizing. She gave me that word, I love it. And there is, you can imagine there's lots of benefits, but they haven't been actually studied that well, but there are benefits to self-compassion. The most obvious of these is emotional resilience, right? So you're not so emotional on a seesaw. There's lessening of stress and anxiety and depression. The other is emotional intelligence. So you have your self-awareness increases, your sense of empowerment and agency in the world. You're open to learning new ways and new things. And then, of course, interpersonal relationships. Because we feel more connected to ourselves, we also feel more connected to others. We're more accepting of others. We're less controlling and even less detached. And I also want to point out that there's a difference, or Neff points this out, that there's a difference between self-compassion and self-esteem. These are two very different things. And self-esteem is a good thing. It's about our sense of self-worth, right? That's a good thing. But the problem with self-esteem is that when things go wrong and your ego takes a beating or is threatened in some shape or form, self-esteem can often take a hike. But self-compassion is always there for you. because self-compassion doesn't rely on judgment of our self-worth. So how do we get, say, more compassionate, right? And interestingly enough, with all this research about self-compassion, there's actually little research about how to develop our sense of self-compassion. This is sort of a new field that people are doing. It's relatively new. And certainly there's different forms of things that you can do, like meditation. So on the first and third Sundays of every month, we have a meditation here, led by Amelia and Marilyn. If you'd like to come here and learn a little bit about meditation, that can help. Simply being mindful of those motions when they come up, when you hear that little voice going, really, Sean, really? You know, you go, okay, thank you. You know, so being mindful of them. And there are some therapeutic modalities that can help as well if you want to seek therapy, that sort of thing. That's a whole nother sermon, but we'll get to that at some point. So, but how do you get to that state where you can be really, truly compassionate? Because it's easy to just sort of say, oh, well, just be self-compassionate, but what does that look like? What is it that all these poets and everybody's been trying to describe, and how do you get to that place of spirit? You know, most of us, I believe, have experienced this, that place that's within us, what the Dalai Lama called the Buddha nature. I like to think it's kind of a compassionate core that exists in everyone. Now, there's a way of accessing that place within us that's naturally compassionate, and Richard Schwartz, he's a psychologist, is one of the first to sort of identify these qualities of what it means to be in that spirit place, that Buddha nature. He simply calls it the self state. And he defines 8 qualities, and you may not have them all at once, but you might have some of these. So one is simply you're calm. You have a sense of inner calm. The second is you have confidence. You feel solid and sure in your knowing. Oops. You got curiosity. In other words, curiosity, you're not judging people. You're not judging yourself. You're just letting simply things be. There's also a clarity to the world, to what you're seeing and who you are. And you feel connected. You feel connected to people around you, to the earth. You may have some sense of connectedness to spirit. There's confidence again. You feel sure of yourself and what you're doing. You think creatively. You're open to sort of new ways. Rather than thinking it's this way or that way and I have to choose, you think of a third way, a new way. You feel courageous. You know you're doing something that might be a little different. You're feeling courageous about it. And of course, you feel compassion. Now, if you're trying to get into a state that embodies these qualities, and you got that inner critic there going, yeah, it's not working, not helping, just ask that inner critic to just step aside for a little bit. Let it happen. So I'd like to just take a moment to see if we can access this. Because I'm guessing that most of you have felt that sense of connectedness, calmness, whatever it is. I remember the first time I felt this way, one of my dearest friends told me she was pregnant. And I just remember thinking, oh, this baby's gonna come into this wonderful family and be raised. And it just was like this joy that permeated. And I felt all of this, just connected, calm, compassionate. So if you just take a moment again to go to that place inward, see if you can recall a time when you just felt your best self, your highest self. Just take a few deep breaths and soften your eyes. Remember, if you hear a little voice, just ask them to set aside for a moment. Think of a time when maybe you felt calm, like a still lake in the evening. strong and confident, like an oak tree. And openly curious, not feeling judgmental about what's happening, just being curious. Maybe you felt open to new possibilities. You felt clear about who you were and what you needed to do. You felt that inner conviction to speak truth, maybe to yourself or to others. And you had that courage, that groundedness. You felt connected to those around you, to nature. Maybe you felt a sense of love toward others. And notice if you feel this anywhere in your body. So when you're there, this is yourself, your Buddha nature. And it's always there for you. It's the deepest core of who you are. I'd like to invite you back here into the room. Some deep breaths. If you want to ever do this whenever you're feeling ungrounded, unclear, it's a great meditation to do. But I kind of want to take a little bit of a different tack for just a minute. One of the things that we do is we often put emotions into two different categories, right? There's good emotions and there's bad emotions. The good is compassion and joy and happiness, and bad is anger and fear and depression. But I believe that this is a false dichotomy. Now, granted, there are some emotions that are more comfortable than others, but they aren't bad simply because they're uncomfortable. Being in a compassionate state can help you when you're dealing with difficult or uncomfortable emotions. But I want to also point out that anger, fear, depression, despair, these are not bad emotions. And self-compassion is not to be used as a club to try and get rid of them. Begone, anger, I banish thee with love. It's not a spell. Self-compassion is about listening to these parts, these emotional parts of ourselves, and what they have to tell us. Because emotions are often simply signals about what's going on inside. And I'm grateful to Sarah Hunter in this congregation. She sent me this wonderful article by this guy, Miguel Clark Mattel. Mattel, as a man, and in particular as a black man, was taught three things. One, don't be emotional. All emotions are bad. Any men here relate to that? Women? B, to repress those emotions. And C, that emotions can be used to stereotype women and minorities. We must not be a stereotype, so write the angry black man or the hysterical woman. But he realized that these emotions turned out to be his friends because they had messages for him. He wrote this: I think of the educated, intelligent women, past and present, encouraged to medicate or procreate away or simply ignore their discontent about society's limitations on their lives. I think of LGBT people who are told to this day that their desire for even self-acceptance is a symptom of sin or disease. I think of people of color told to overlook or rise above with forgiveness and a smile rather than anger the oppression and violence visited on them. I think of those with mental and physical disabilities told to feel grateful rather than angry for the crumbs they get from a culture that refuses to commit to increasing access? Is their anger, their depression, their fear, their grief negative? Or is it a healthy, positive response to a culture that encourages them to devalue themselves? Is it a healthy, positive response to a culture that encourages them to devalue themselves? He continues, I no longer see my depression and grief, anxiety, and anger as enemies. I try to treat them as messengers sent to caution me, to remind me of the need for self-care, to help reassess and release attachments, to encourage me to re-examine values, to suggest that it's time to revisit and revise the story of my identity, to come to my rescue. I love that. Because recently I got really angry. I got an email from Laura Cantor at the LGBTQ Center informing me that there were attacks on the comprehensive sexual health education mandated by California law by those who didn't want anything to do with the LGBT or Q taught in our schools. And I'm so tired of these guerrilla tactics, right? They lost on marriage equality, so they're going to go after our kids now. Feels like they come out of nowhere and they go after our very high American ideals of inclusivity and freedom bit by bit. And I got angry. So I decided to use that anger instead and get involved with what's called Youth First of Orange County. You're going to hear more about it this morning from Laura herself. So what makes you angry, afraid, or depressed? Are you angry that today white supremacists are in Washington, D.C. spouting hate and dehumanization? Are you afraid for our environment, all the pollution and corporate greed? Are you depressed over the state of our nation? These emotions, they're messengers. Love these messengers. Love yourself for having them. They've got something to tell you. So next time you get angry, whether it's at the world or your boss, you get depressed or fearful, first, get curious. Go to that place where compassion lives and give some of it to yourself. And then find the message. These emotions that we call negative, they're not bad. They're not negative. It's what we do with those emotions that can be harmful or they can be helpful. If we use them instead as messengers to help us see a new way, develop a new story about ourselves and our world, if we can use them to motivate us to self-compassion, they can lead us to help change our communities and our lives, they are most definitely positive. So next time you're feeling that depressed, angry, fearful, I invite you to look at them as messengers who are trying to help you. Give those parts some love. Get into that self-state and practice self-compassion. Don't slice off a piece of your flesh. You're just killing yourself. Self-compassion isn't about getting rid of the uncomfortable emotions. It's about loving all of you and realizing that every part of you is a messenger. Love is every part of you. Love every part of you. Every part. And listen to what they have to say. Let's let love guide us. Blessed be and amen.
information for all of our ministries here at Orange Coast Unitarian University.